Welcome to Fishing Bridge in Yellowstone National Park. Today's virtual Yellowstone tour is covering the section of road between Fishing Bridge and West Thumb Geyser Basin, one of my favorite geyser basins, in fact probably my favorite geyser basin in all of Yellowstone. Let's take a look at where we are as we leave Fishing Bridge behind us. If you go to the following of our sites, westyellowstonelodge.com/map. That's westyellowstonelodge.com/map. You'll see a map of Yellowstone. You'll notice that the roads through the park make up a massive figure of 8. Companies like ours divide their tours into a tour of the upper loop of the figure of 8 and a tour of the lower loop of the figure of 8. And you'll notice that there's a road that divides the massive figure of 8 into the 2 loops, and that road runs between Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone to the left or the west side, and on the east side to Norris Geyser Basin on the west or left of the map. If you go down or south from Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, you'll go through the Hayden Valley, you'll pass Mud Volcano and Sulphur Cauldron, and then you'll get to Fishing Bridge, which is just a little to the north or a little bit up from Lake Hotel. And talking of Lake Hotel, we're coming to the Lake Hotel area pretty soon, just around the next corner. So that's where Fishing Bridge is, on the east side of Yellowstone, on Yellowstone's lower loop. Fishing Bridge is so called because it's a bridge, obviously, and people used to fish from there for cutthroat trout. The original bridge was built in 1902. It was quite a rough bridge made out of corduroy logs. And this over here is the lake area. That's where Lake Hotel is, one of the wonderful hotels in the national park system. The existing bridge was built in 1937. And after a while, even though the angling was quite good, or probably because the angling was so good, fishing was banned from Fishing Bridge. All the cutthroat trout, or most of them, had been fished out of the water. And so fishing was no longer allowed from Fishing Bridge, although you can still go there and walk across the bridge and look out on the one side to the north to the Yellowstone River and the other side to the south to the start of Yellowstone Lake. Yellowstone Lake is the largest alpine lake in the United States. By alpine lake, I mean a lake that's situated at altitude. There are larger lakes in the United States. Lake Tahoe is larger, but Yellowstone Lake is the largest alpine lake. It's also the second largest alpine lake in the world. We will get a better view of it, although you can see it through the trees. See, it's a little choppy today. The wind has come up. You are incidentally allowed to boat on Yellowstone Lake. In fact, I don't know if you can see it, but there is actually a boat out there on the lake. This section of road basically follows the shoreline of Yellowstone Lake and lands up at West Thumb Geyser Basin. You're going to see as we continue along the road that there is not much in the way of thermal features along this road. It is a really pretty drive, but what you see at the moment is what you get. A lot of lake and a lot of trees. As we see the speed limit decrease, we're coming up to what's called Bridge Bay, and pretty soon on our right hand side we'll be going across another bridge, not Fishing Bridge, but another bridge which allows water, here it is over here, which allows water to get into a small marina. And if we have a look, we can see the boats in the marina. Now, as you might imagine, it gets really cold here, and Yellowstone Lake freezes over every winter, and because of that, people have to take their boats out of the water. The ice gets up to about 3 feet thick, that's almost a meter thick, over almost the entire lake. About the only place that it doesn't freeze over is where there are thermal features in the more shallow areas. So where you have a thermal feature and there's not that much water on top of it, that part won't freeze over. But for the rest, the lake tends to freeze over completely. Unfortunately, it's generally not possible to see Yellowstone Lake in the winter. I say generally because this part of the park is closed in the winters to regular traffic like cars and buses and motorbikes. Some of the roads in Yellowstone are open in the winter, as I've discussed in others of these virtual Yellowstone tours. The park headquarters is at Mammoth Hot Springs, so that road stays open on a year-round basis. Then at the northeast entrance, and you can see what I mean by a lot of trees, we're going to be seeing a lot more of them. Then at the northeast entrance to Yellowstone, you have the small communities of Crook City and Silvergate. And because the road on the other side of Crook City and Silvergate is closed in the winters, that would be the Beartooth Highway, it's closed because of the huge volumes of snow. Because that road is closed, the people who would otherwise have gone down to the south east to Cody or to the northeast to Red Lodge to get supplies and services and just buy whatever they need, because they can no longer do that, the road from the northeast entrance up to Tower Junction and then from Tower Junction to Mammoth Hot Springs, those roads have to stay open, and then the folks from Crook City and Silvergate are able to leave the park from the Gardner entrance and head off into Montana to get their services. It's interesting to note that although 97% of the park is in the state of Wyoming, 3 of Yellowstone's entrances are in Montana and 2 are in Wyoming. 2% of the park is in Montana, 1% approximately is in Idaho. So you've got West Yellowstone, which is the busiest entrance, being in Montana. You've got the north entrance, as I mentioned, Gardner, being in Montana, and the northeast entrance is also in Montana. The 2 Wyoming entrances are what I hesitate to call the Cody entrance. It's more the east entrance, but Cody is the closest city, but Cody is still 52 odd miles away from the east entrance, and it takes you over an hour to get there. And then the south entrance is in Wyoming. You would come up through from Jackson and Jackson Hole through Grand Teton National Park, across the Rockefeller Parkway, and then into the south entrance of Yellowstone. So with the exception of the exception of the north entrance, which is open to the public on a year-round basis, the other 3 entrances, with the exception of the northeast entrance, which I've already discussed, are closed to cars in the winters. You can take a guided snow coach or snowmobile tour when the park is open for the winter season, and that generally starts somewhere around the 3rd week, halfway through the 3rd week of December, and it runs until about the 3rd, 4th of March, depending on when the weekends fall. And you can take a guided snow coach or snowmobile tour into Yellowstone. In recent years as well, the Park Service has instituted a lottery where keen snowmobilers, or just people who want to get into Yellowstone like me, can pay a small fee, select certain dates. You can select up to 8 dates, and each date can encompass 3 separate consecutive days, or anywhere from 1 to 3 days. And then if you're lucky, you can get a permit to go into Yellowstone during the winter, during that time period. Having said that, there are some restrictions. When President Clinton banned snowmobiling in the park, and when he was running for re-election, and the second President Bush only partially reversed the ban, one of the requirements that came about as a result of numerous lawsuits was that the snowmobiles that are allowed into the park have to be what's called BAT, Best Available Technology. So you're not allowed 2-stroke snowmobiles. They have to be 4 strokes, and they have to be 4-stroke snowmobiles that use the most recent technology. And with these cars driving so slowly, I think that once again I'm going to pull out somewhere and give them time to get ahead of us. Otherwise, this virtual Yellowstone tour will run into hours rather than half an hour. Looks like I can pull over here, and I will continue the Yellowstone tour once the cars have pulled out sufficiently far ahead. And we're back on the road again. I was talking about the need to use best available technology snowmobiles. So that's what you have to do, and then you also have to take a short online course to be allowed to come into the park. The reason that access to the park is so strictly regulated is primarily because of the well-being of animals in Yellowstone during the winter months. I mentioned to you before that it gets so brutally cold here that it's very difficult for the animals to survive. There's also a lot of snow in Yellowstone. The coldest part of Yellowstone, the coldest recorded temperature, has been at Yellowstone's west entrance. I think it's about minus 38 degrees. And when it's that cold and when there's so much snow, particularly, the buffalo, for example, have a lot of difficulty in getting to their food, which is the shrubs and the grass that they like to eat. You see them eating it all the time when you're in Yellowstone in the summer months. Generally speaking, when there's about 3 feet or a little less than a meter of snow down, buffalo are able to burrow down to it. But once it gets much deeper than that, it becomes very challenging. And what happens is the buffalo start starving to death. They can't get any food. They starve to death. So over the course of many court cases that have taken place about winter access to Yellowstone, it was determined that you wouldn't be allowed to bring your own vehicle in, and you would have to follow the rules and take a guided snowmobile or snow coach tour. Or nowadays, as I mentioned in recent years, you can take your own snowmobile in if you're lucky enough to draw a permit. What the buffalo and some of the other animals do during the winter to try and get away from the cold is to go into the thermal features. And because the thermal features, as the name suggests, are hot, you don't get the volume of snow there. The snow tends to melt a lot more quickly than it does elsewhere. In fact, in some thermal areas there isn't any snow at all because of the heat. However, and unfortunately, the shrubbery, the grass, whatever else the buffalo and the elk eat, has a mineral in it that causes their teeth to start to disintegrate. The buffalo and the other animals obviously don't know this, so they're grateful for the warmth, they're grateful to be able to get something to eat, but their teeth slowly start to dissolve, and once their teeth dissolve, they're no longer able to eat anyway, so they actually starve to death. So it's a case of pick your poison. Do you want to die by not being able to burrow down to get the food under the snow, or because your teeth disintegrate? Whichever way you look at it, winters are incredibly tough here in the Yellowstone area. It has another adverse effect on the buffalo as well, as I've mentioned. Look at these bikers here. This is the week before Sturgis, and Sturgis is a big rally, a big bike rally at the small town of Sturgis, which only has about 7,000 people, and you get about 250,000 people, 250,000 people descending on a tiny community like that. So we get a lot of bikers passing through here the weeks before and the weeks after Sturgis takes place. One other issue in the winters that really affects the buffalo and has been a political hot potato in Yellowstone for decades is that, and I know I've mentioned this many times, buffalo are not very smart, but there are two things that they know. One, that it's easier to walk on the roads than through the forests, and when they walk on the roads they cause these buffalo jams that we get here in Yellowstone. The other thing about buffalo is they know that instinctively in the summer months it'll be cooler for them at the higher elevations, and so they tend to go there, and in the winter months they like to descend down to the lower elevations where it'll be a little warmer. Unfortunately, one of the lower elevations at 5,300 feet approximately is Yellowstone's north entrance, and as I mentioned before, the north entrance goes out into the state of Montana at the small town of Gardner. Now, buffalo don't know where the park boundary starts and ends. Once they leave the park, they don't have the same protection that they would have inside Yellowstone. Obviously, inside Yellowstone, you're not allowed to hunt animals, or poach or kill animals. And once they leave the park, they don't have those same protections. So once buffalo leave the park, they are literally fair game, if you'll excuse the pun. The concern amongst the Montana authorities is that buffalo are known to carry a disease called brucellosis. Brucellosis can conceivably be transferred to the domestic cattle herd, and if cows start becoming infected with brucellosis, it could have enormously adverse effects on the cow population in Montana. My windshield had a bug fly into it, so I'm just going to stop and clean my windshield over here. I'll continue with the brucellosis story. Well, the windshield looks a lot better now, and I was telling you about buffalo and brucellosis. It's known that buffalo carry a disease called brucellosis. As I mentioned, the concern is that when they wander out of the park, that a domestic cattle herd, a cow or bull, could come into contact with the brucellosis and contract it. It's very difficult for that to actually happen, though. In order for a cow or bull to contract brucellosis, it needs to come into very close contact with the afterbirth of a baby buffalo. There's never been a known instance of this actually happening, of brucellosis being passed from a buffalo in Yellowstone to the domestic cattle herd. Still, it is a big concern, particularly in Montana. So what the Park Service decided to do most recently is build pens at the north entrance to Yellowstone, and as the buffalo started to migrate heading north out of the park, they would be captured, corralled in those pens. They would be tested for brucellosis. If a buffalo had brucellosis, then it would be put down. If it didn't have brucellosis, it would be allowed to wander off. This solution did not appeal to either the conservationists or to those who are more on the right. And so we still have a political hot potato with the buffalo, and I can go into a lot more detail and do so in others of these virtual Yellowstone tours, but we only have about another 5 miles, if that, to West Thumb, and there's a lot more I need to tell you about the area that we are going through. Yellowstone Lake, I started talking about just on the other side of these trees at the start of this virtual Yellowstone tour, and then I got sidetracked as usual. One problem with Yellowstone Lake is the lake trout, which have completely decimated then the cutthroat trout species, the cutthroat trout population. And here we start to see the lake coming into view again. Isn't that beautiful, with the mountains in the background there? So the Park Service decided that they needed to eradicate the cutthroat trout, and they came up with various ideas of how to do this, perhaps electrifying the fish, perhaps introducing a type of eel into the water, but you can only imagine what the consequences might have been of yet another non-native species being introduced into Yellowstone Lake. And eventually the authorities decided that they would use gill nets to capture the lake trout. Now you may be asking yourself, maybe saying to yourself, well, aren't gill nets frowned upon elsewhere in the fishing world? And yes, they are. But here they actually proved to be quite an admirable solution. It was known that the lake trout tend to exist at lower levels, deeper down, in other words, in the lake, than the cutthroat trout do. So firstly, the gill nets were placed lower in the lake. Secondly, the holes in the nets were such that it was more difficult for the larger lake trout to swim through the holes in the nets. In fact, they were going to be caught for the most part by the holes in the nets than the cutthroat trout, which are a lot smaller. The problem was that the lake trout were not a native species in Yellowstone Lake. They had probably been introduced illegally from either the nearby Shoshone Lake or the nearby Lewis Lake, where the fish were intentionally stocked certainly more than 100 years ago. But the introduction of the lake trout into the Yellowstone Lake ecosystem had an enormously adverse effect on the cutthroat trout. The cutthroat trout population diminished by about 90%. So there were only, for those of you who are not as much of a genius as math as I am, there were only about 10% of the lake trout left. Of the cutthroat trout left. The lake trout are voracious eaters. They can eat about 40 of the native cutthroat trout every year. And in next to no time, the cutthroat trout population was absolutely decimated, and it obviously then had that adverse effect on not only the cutthroat trout themselves, but also the grizzly here, the grizzly bears, which like to eat them, the otters, which feed on the cutthroat trout, and also ospreys. So those species were also really adversely affected. So I mentioned that the Park Service introduced gill netting into the park. And in 2019, which were the last set of figures that I saw, the lake trout haul, the number of lake trout that were taken out, can you see the pale area over there indicating a thermal area? they were 30% lower approximately. The catch of lake trout was about 30% lower than it had been in 2017, when the gill netters removed almost 400,000 fish. And this is likely to be taking place because there are fewer mature lake trout in Yellowstone Lake. And when they talk about mature lake trout, they mean lake trout that are 6 years or older. So this is pretty significant. If you don't have the mature lake trout in the lake anymore, there's not going to be as much breeding. In addition, what the scientists and the Park Service did was they took the dead lake trout and then dumped them over the side of the boats, and with the intention that the dead fish were going to land on top of the breeding grounds of the lake trout. So we get to go, when I say we, tour companies such as ours who have authority to operate in Yellowstone, we get to go to these meetings every year, and they're just tremendous, where the Park Service has the world authorities on fish in the park, and grizzlies and elk and various other aspects of Yellowstone, and we get to hear the latest scientific research from these experts. Anyway, I asked the fish scientist, well, how do you know that the dead fish are actually going to land up on the breeding ground? Because to me it seemed a bit of a long shot that you could just drop the fish overboard and they'd be lucky enough to land on the breeding areas. And he gave me this withering look, which I probably deserved. And he said, well, what we do actually is we have divers going down and they guide the dead fish onto the breeding areas. Oh my goodness, we're almost at West Thumb Geyser Basin, and I haven't even had a chance to tell you about West Thumb. Please take a look at one of our other virtual Yellowstone tours on West Thumb Geyser Basin for a lot of information about West Thumb. I may have mentioned that it's my favorite I think I did mention it's my favorite geyser basin in the entire park, being right on the shores of the incredibly beautiful Yellowstone Lake. Guys, we have come to the end of another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. Thank you so much for joining me on today's virtual Yellowstone tour between Fishing Bridge and West Thumb. If you enjoy our virtual Yellowstone tours, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Otherwise, I hope you make it to Yellowstone one day.